and welcome to everybody who is watching for another one of our sessions for the Let's Hatch It Out series. Today, we're going to be talking about the startup journey, and we have with us Fauzan Shah. Fauzan has a decade's worth of experience in valuation, serving as the CFO at Impex Group in Pakistan, and he's the founder of Astore Partners, as well as a strategy advisor for MyGhar, a startup helping to solve the housing and accommodation problem for young working individuals in Pakistan. So today's conversation will be around the journey of a startup from the point of ideation to execution, and along the way, through the process of raising investment and building the right team. So we're going to ask Fauzan to give us an overview of what the startup journey looks like, or what the ideal startup journey looks like for those watching who are aspiring entrepreneurs or working in the startup sector overall. This conversation will be beneficial for all of them. So Fauzan, to start off with, the past few years we've seen the trend in entrepreneurship growing exponentially in Pakistan. With incubation centers, with COVID and flexible working opportunities, and the rise of fintech, edtech, and just tech overall as well. So much more people are inclined towards entrepreneurship and exploring the startup avenue. So in your experience, would you like to take us through the startup journey, specifically the starting processes? What do you think the mistakes do you see startups making, and how can they be avoided, which can help them grow further?
Sure. Thank you for the time. I think generally there's a very clear template that's available online, and it's about fundraising and that framework generally applies to how you actually approach solving a problem and solving it from the get-go. So in essence, what I mean is the first step to this is actually identifying the problem you're trying to solve. And when you identify the problem that, okay, this is a problem that needs solving and it's a monetizable solution that I can create for that, the important thing is to actually understand, is that problem that is something being faced by more people, or is it something that only you are facing? So it's about going out and conducting user interviews, talking to them, okay, are you facing this problem? And if they are, then, okay, what's the solution? When you're approaching the problem, it's also good to sort of understand, is it an actual problem or is it a nice to have? Like, for example, something like in Pakistan right now, the grocery deliveries are becoming very popular. But will a grocery delivery that's delivering to your house in 30 minutes solve a problem, or is it a nice thing to have? Versus compared to something like any of the fintechs, which are solving a bigger problem, which includes inclusivity, lending, and stuff, things like that. So it's about understanding what problem you're trying to solve, and is it actually monetizable or not. So that's step number one. Then you sort of come towards the solution that you have, and again, when you sort of approach the solution, you have to think of it in a framework of how big of an impact will it have on the user's life. For example, if a current situation, if the problem requires you to go through 90 steps, for lack of a better word, and your solution brings it down to 80 steps, is it still worthwhile for the person to pay that money? Because you're only, in essence, saving like 8 steps, right? 8 to 10 steps. But if you come up with a solution which brings it down to 10 steps, that is actually creating a lot of value for it. So your solution automatically speaks for for its customers that this is something that is very useful for us, and that we should go and actually try and use this and buy this, and we'll be willing to spend money on this. So it's about, when you're creating the solution, it's about creating the solution in a way which will translate across to users very easily, and they know that this is something that they will be willing to pay for. Which sort of leads into the other part, which is what we call sort of unit economics, which is that for 1 unit of creating that solution, how much money will you make? So if you're selling a subscription, okay, I'm going to charge someone 200 rupees to do that. Well, that's good, but how much does it cost you to actually sell that thing to them? So if it's going to cost you 50 rupees, then it's good. But if it's going to cost you 300 rupees, then it's not really a good business. That's where VCs come in, because a lot of the software solutions are very scalable. So what I mean is that they can only cost you like 50 rupees. You'll pay 100 rupees and it costs you 50 rupees, but that's not going to be enough to cover your expenses for the first 2 to 3 years. So the VCs understand this and they back the business accordingly. And the fourth and final step in this is to actually identify how big of a market it is. Is it a problem that only you face, or is it a problem that everyone else around you is facing? And how much money is actually you unlock by creating this product? And rule of thumb generally is that your TAM, which is your total addressable market, should be greater than $1 billion in Pakistan, because that is how a company of high valuation can be created. Oh, with the caveat, this is what the VCs will want or want to see. It is paramount that I think currently the problem we're seeing right now in the startup industry is that raising money and is is almost like a sexy thing to do. Everyone wants to have the founder tag next to them. They want that article in the newspaper saying, "Oh, X person raised a certain amount of $1 million." So there's a misalignment of incentives. People are thinking about raising funds because they think that's cool and that's the hip thing to do, without realizing, okay, what are we actually getting ourselves into? So people focus too much on fundraising without actually thinking of what problem we're solving. And does that problem actually even require VC funds? Because the VC business model is actually very different, as I sort of alluded to earlier.
So before we come on to financials, I want to talk a little more about what do you think is lacking in the industry? So we've talked about, the ideation stage and the problem identification and how important that is before a business decides to scale up or is able to do so. So do you think it's the practical knowledge that is lacking? Do people not do enough research? Are they too risk averse, or do they just lack the field experience or the field research that is really necessary before actually, launching on ground?
There are multiple things. There's nothing wrong as such. Basically, Pakistan's tech industry is very young, right? It's right now, even though we raised like $300 million plus in 2021, it's still quite peanuts compared to what's happening in the rest of the world. So it's very hard to pinpoint, X, Y, or Z is the main cause of the tech industry not booming. But as I was sort of saying earlier, there is currently a misalignment of incentives. People think that, okay, we're just raising funds because we think it's sexy. But before, when I have conversations with founders, my question always to them is, okay, have you prototyped your solution? It doesn't mean that you come up with an app straight away, because obviously that requires a lot of things, but can you do it on Excel or can you do it manually and get this thing to work, right? Because that is the most important part, is that can you actually show that the idea that you have on a very basic level works? And then the second thing that you sort of see missing from entrepreneurs right now, like in my experiences, they haven't actually translated what that money they're raising is going to translate into. So by that, a lot of the money that is VCs raises goes towards customer acquisition, which is basically online marketing or digital marketing. And digital marketing, without getting into too much detail, sort of is broken down into CPM, CTRs, and your conversions. And these things are something that the founders should really know and have a grasp of. And they can do it by spending like 2,000 or 5,000 rupees online just to see how it works for them. But they haven't done that. And then plus this combined with prototypes or like just very beta version of their products, it becomes, or pilots, if you want to call it. These are things that everyone needs to do before they start approaching VCs or before they start going out and raising funds. The problem within the whole fundraising sector itself is that it's a very there are only like 10 VCs or less than that in Pakistan. With 4 of them are the big players, which everyone knows: Zen Capital, Indus Valley, MyGhar, Fatma Gobi. All the other funds are sort of smaller funds which sort of go around with the bigger ones, and they collaborate when they invest. So when that is happening, there aren't enough angel investors as well to actually provide funding to startups at a pre-seed and seed stage, because that is by far the most important thing. And interestingly, if you look at what will happen, or what I can sort of foresee happening over the next 6 to 12 months within the startup ecosystem, it's that right now there's a funding squeeze that's going to happen simply because of the Ukraine war, the global tech sell-off, and things like that. And because of that, a lot of startups will struggle to raise funds going forward. So a few startups which want to do a Series A or a Series B could sort of shut down, or they will do like a hiring freeze, and it might disillusion a few of their top employees or the ones who've had a lot of experiences. And they might say, you know what, we spent enough time at these companies. I want to do my own startup now. I have the startup experience. I have that CV. And those founders will sort of enter the market in the next 6 to 12 months or 6 to 18 months. And they could really have a knock on impact in terms of sort of having exponential growth to the Pakistani startup ecosystem, similar to what Kareem did a few years ago.
Okay, so you think that the startup ecosystem is going to take a little kind of a different shift, which we might not have been expecting, like let's say a year ago.
Yeah. My gut feel is that basically the big numbers of raises that we were seeing, they might not happen anymore. Simply because funds like Tiger Global and they are or SoftBank for that matter are not doing that well. So they'll stop new allocations. Once they've stopped that, that means a few of the companies which were sort of relying to burn that money won't be able to raise. So those big raises might not happen, but which is okay because this is how the ecosystem grows. So there's nothing wrong with that. Startups, if you look at the global numbers, 90% plus of them fail, and 90% is me being generous. It should be like 95 to 98% of them fail. So when they're failing, you want your top employees who have had this experience, who've gone through the mill of actually raising funds, of actually deploying capital, of acquiring customers, and understand what they need to do, understand the A/B testing they need to do in terms of deployment. They actually go back to the drawing board and say, okay, this is another problem we see that is happening. I need funds for that. And then they approach angel investors or specialist pre-seed funds, which should actually grow, in my opinion, because that is where the growth opportunity in the market is. And once they grow, they could actually sort of lead into further opportunities within the ecosystem.
All right. So you mentioned, with those people who are working in the startup sector with the experience of raising funds and raising investment, going out to investors, pitching their ideas. So I think that's one of the things that Astore does as well, right? They help out such people with kind of refining their ideas. So can we talk a bit more about when somebody, walk me through what a day looks like or a meeting looks like when somebody comes to you and they say that, we have this startup idea and we want to raise finances or we want to raise investment. So what does that process look like?
For us, generally, that means we just generally go through their pitch deck first. We understand what they're actually trying to say, and then we sort of try to make sure the vision, if we're working together, we want to make sure the vision is coherent and you're actually selling what the market needs, that the problem that you're solving is actually in demand in the market, and you can actually raise funds for that because you can so once you've done that, then the next step is you actually understand how you're actually going to be acquiring your customers. If your product is something which is direct to consumer, and you're going to be spending money on digital on social media, have you done any experiments? Have you seen what your returns are? Because those inputs are the key thing to grow your business. Until and unless they understand that, until and unless they are very, very comfortable with the numbers they're seeing and what is driving those numbers, there's no point having more discussion on raising funds to deploy because they need to understand how that money will impact their own product. So we have a discussion around that, and generally when we sort of we have a look at the pitch deck as well, that the vision and the message is very clear on what they're trying to do. There's no science to fundraising. To be very honest, it's very much an art form. So it's about just making sure you're coherent, you're consistent, and a few things matter. And we can try to be as egalitarian as we want, but your CV matters. If you worked at some of the top startups in Pakistan, if you worked overseas at some of the top institutes, and the problem you're solving is good, people will feel a lot more comfortable funding you rather than compared to someone who's just out of university because they think that's too big of a risk. They do not know whether it's credentials or solid. So if the team is good, then making sure your credentials are coming through, and then you're actually showing that you have relevant experience in this field.
So would you then, off the bat, suggest to somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur to actually first go out and look at the market and seek experience from the market itself rather than just jumping the guns and starting their own venture?
No, if someone wants to be an entrepreneur, it's about that whole thing again, that you can't just be an entrepreneur just for sake of being one, right? It's about actually, again, as I said, there are two types of problems. There's a problem which is a pressing problem that needs solving, and then there are things which are nice to have. Like if you sort of go back, like Instagram, the way it started, it was a photo sharing tool on social media, on Facebook, right? No one really thought that was a problem that needed solving, but it was a nice thing to have, and they marketed it well. The product was excellent, and it took off. Right? And now it's like one of the top social media applications in the world. But if you sort of try the whole problem solution framework, it doesn't really fit into that. But the thing with Pakistan is that Pakistan itself, the ecosystem and the economy isn't as well developed. So there's a lot of opportunity for startups to pick low hanging fruit, whether it be in fintech, whether it be in logistics, whether it be in multiple sectors. So it's all about picking your choice, picking your sector, solving that problem, and then taking it forward. But again, it's about if someone wants to be an entrepreneur, my advice to them is spend 3 to 4 months figuring out what is the problem you're trying to solve. And is that, and then, okay, you've picked a problem, everyone else is facing that problem, you know what the solution is to solve that problem. You need to figure out obviously the regulation around it. Then how do you make money out of that? What is your monetization? Because again, like without getting into too many specifics, a SaaS business runs at like 60% or 70% gross margin. So can you understand how you're going to make that money? Because it's probably a conversation for another time, but people really need to understand that when they're approaching VCs, there's only a certain model of businesses that can get funded. And VC funding itself is, you can sort of do the maths on it, because the way VC funds work on a very high level, I think most of your listeners will probably know this already, but they raise funds for returns in 10 years. So they're investing over a 10-year horizon. And because they take bets across like 10 different companies, they expect 8 of them to fail. But that one company they expect will grow 100 times their investment. So that is the only way they make their money. So you have to understand, okay, does my business work on those lines?
Absolutely. So Fauzan, one of our earlier guest speakers, and I think it was Badr Khusnood, or maybe Nadeem actually from Neem, we were talking about the fintech industry specifically, and one of them said this thing that raising funding is the easy part. It's not that difficult to raise funding, but actually how to use that funding, or once you've secured it, what to do with it, that's the difficult part. So do you agree with that? And if so, what would you say of, once the startup has secured the funding, be it in this Seed A round, or what to do with that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, he's not wrong at all. What basically, I wouldn't say raising funds is easy. Raising funds is hard as well, but deploying is much harder. The thing is, you can raise funds for once, and then you have an 18-month time horizon on that front. To deploy it, because that 12 to 18 months is the runway that people generally have. Once you do that, the next step is your execution strategy is what's going to set you apart. If you execute well, your company will grow. If you execute badly, your company will shut down. And it will become that much harder for you to raise funds in your next round, right? For your next venture. So it's about understanding that. And so absolutely deploying capital is by far the most important thing and the hardest thing, because capital allocation as a strategy is something that is difficult and is something that requires a lot of on the ground effort. It involves luck, which I think no one can deny. But more than that, it involves actually thinking about your business in a very deep manner and then making the right choices. And the things, so I mentioned this earlier, like one thing that is very important is called A/B testing. So you deploy funds in two things. You do an experiment, see what's the return on each of them, then pick, okay, was A the right return or B the right return, and then follow through on that one. And you keep on doing that. You keep on iterating. So like that iteration and self-reflection is very important. Like one further thing I'll add to this is that in Pakistan, people think that, or not in this, but like globally, people think that their idea is the most important thing and no one has thought of that. It's not like that at all. Ideas are common. So if anyone listening or watching has an idea, I will actually encourage them to go out and speak to people around them, get their feedback, because that is the most important thing. Get that feedback. The idea can be copied, that's fine, but the person who executes that idea will be the winner at the end of the day. An idea is worth nothing without proper execution behind it.
Absolutely. Just the last question to kind of wrap this up would be, where do you see Pakistan's startup ecosystem going in the next 5 years?
5 years is a long horizon. I think, considering the global financial situation right now, we expect that this will go on for at least a year or so. Like, there'll be a bit of a financial turmoil. So if that is happening, I expect that the ecosystem itself, as I said, I think it'll be a bit of a downturn, and there needs to be an uptick. The biggest thing that we're waiting for in this cycle is actually an exit for a big Pakistani startup. And by exit, I mean either a big startup is acquired or it lists on one of the stock exchanges, and people can actually say that, okay, we've cashed out on all the money we've invested. In a 5-year horizon, you definitely need one big one to be able to make sure everyone's thesis on Pakistan as the next frontier will work. Because if that doesn't happen, then it's very difficult to see the funding continuing to come into Pakistan.
Do you have your bets on any one or two startups in that case, or no?
Generally, I think the B2B space is interesting. B2C is very tough in Pakistan simply because people do, like, obviously we have the numbers behind us in terms of 220 million people, X amount of, like, 70% under the age of 25 or whatever, and X amount of mobile penetration, like 95% plus. But that alone isn't enough because the average person doesn't have a lot of disposable income. So I generally think the B2B space is an interesting place to be. So maybe startups like Jugnu, Bazaar, Dastaki, they are all very interesting. One of them will probably come out to be the winner, or probably it's a big enough market, two or three of them might come out to be the winners. And that's where the real monetization happens. Like, I'm not very bullish on the direct to consumer startups. So your Q-commerce and all those ones. But the others, I think, might have a better shot.
All right. And I think we'll look out to see who actually, takes the cup at the end of the day. Thank you so much, Fauzan, for joining us for this conversation. And hopefully we'll continue having much more sessions. For our listeners, Fauzan is available for different mentorship sessions. So if you're looking to gain any advice on strategy or financials, he's the right person to reach out to. So thank you so much. And we look forward to more conversations.
All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.